No one in Parliament saw it coming. What started as a routine debate turned into a political earthquake when Nigel Farage stood up and delivered one of the most explosive speeches ever heard in the Commons. With eyes locked on him and the room in stunned silence, Farage unleashed a blistering attack that not only shook both major parties to their core, but left even seasoned MPs visibly rattled. His words were sharp, unapologetic, and dangerous in their boldness, the kind of statement that could reshape everything. Let's dive into exactly what happened, and why so many are now calling this a defining moment in British politics. The calm before the storm, it began as just another debate on the House floor. The atmosphere, while tense, was nothing out of the ordinary. MPs were taking their usual positions, some engaged, others barely paying attention. The topic on the agenda seemed predictable: the UK's future in relation to contested overseas territories and the government's new diplomatic strategies. Standard political theatre, or so they thought. But then something shifted. Nigel Farage, leader of Reform UK and a man known for his unfiltered approach, took the floor. There was an immediate change in the room's energy. Even those who usually dismissed him as a political provocateur sat up, and in a tone that was calm but heavy with intent, Farage began to speak. At first, it seemed like a measured critique. A few jabs at the government, some scepticism about current policies. Nothing out of character. But just as many MPs were settling into the usual back and forth, Farage pivoted. And what followed was not just unexpected, it was explosive. He accused both Labour and the Conservatives of running what he described as a two-party con. A long-running political performance designed to keep the public distracted, while real decisions were made behind closed doors. "You've had your turn at power," he declared, his voice rising slightly. "And what have you done with it? You've betrayed this country, again and again, with polished speeches and broken promises." Gasps echoed across the chamber. Some MPs exchanged nervous glances. A few smirked, thinking it was typical Farage drama. But that smirk didn't last long. Farage then tore into the recent Chagos Islands deal, claiming it was not a strategic agreement, but a sellout disguised in diplomatic language. He accused the Prime Minister of bending to international pressure, of caving in to so-called post-colonial guilt, and warned that the consequences of giving away British territory would be far more dangerous than anyone in the government was willing to admit. "You are trading away sovereignty," he said coldly, for nothing more than global applause and short-term headlines. And for what? £52 billion over 99 years. This isn't diplomacy. This is daylight robbery, and you've allowed it to happen. At this point, murmurs broke out on both sides of the chamber. Labour MPs looked furious. Conservatives looked cornered. Farage hadn't just challenged the deal, he had questioned the very integrity of Parliament itself. And he wasn't done. He went on to point out that China already had an economic foothold near Mauritius, and warned that ceding any control over the Chagos Islands could open the door to foreign influence at the UK's expense. He raised the spectre of mineral-rich waters, of strategic marine zones, and of global power games that the current government, according to him, was sleepwalking into. But it was his closing line in this section of the speech that stunned everyone. "If you are so eager to give it all away," he said, pausing for full effect, "at least be honest with the British people about who you're doing it for, because it certainly isn't them." The room fell into a strange kind of silence, not quiet but tense, like a wire pulled tight. Some MPs shouted in protest, others simply sat back, unsure of how to respond. Farage had flipped the conversation. He had changed the tone of the debate from policy to principle, and made it clear he was not afraid to call out those who sat quietly enabling what he called the Great British Giveaway. This was just the beginning. The shockwaves were only starting to ripple outward, and what came next would only deepen the divide. Nigel Farage's next words cascaded over the chamber like an unrelenting torrent, as he shifted the debate from abstract policy to the very soul of British politics, challenging not only the decisions being made, but also the loyalties of every single member present. With unwavering conviction, he painted a picture of a government that had lost sight of national interests, accusing its leaders of being complicit in a grand deception that benefited nothing but a select few. Farage argued that the Chagos Islands deal was the culmination of years of neglecting the country's strategic heritage, daring to claim that the government was prioritising international appeasement over the hard-earned rights of the British people. In a voice that mixed indignation with calculated rhetoric, he recalled past promises and pledged reforms that never materialised, laying bare the inconsistencies of a system mired in its own bureaucratic inertia. "Where has the trust gone?" he demanded, his words resonating like a rallying cry. "When our leaders choose to sign away our sovereignty on a piece of paper, What does that say about their commitment to this nation? His relentless questioning was not just aimed at the government, it was designed to force every MP to confront the uncomfortable reality that compromise on such a critical issue could lead to a slippery slope, undermining the very foundations of British democracy. Farage didn't hold back when he drew comparisons to historical missteps, suggesting that the current deal could well be remembered as the moment when modern Britain began a slow descent into political oblivion, a betrayal of the national heritage for short-term international acclaim. He reminded the chamber that the fiscal ramifications, projected to spiral into astronomical figures over the decades, were not merely numbers on paper, but a testament to mismanagement and a lack of foresight, warning that the cost would ultimately be borne by the ordinary citizens who watched their hard-earned money vanish into the corridors of power. His tone grew more personal as he accused colleagues of cowardice, insinuating that their silence and passive acceptance were tantamount to endorsing this disastrous strategy. Farage's accusations weren't limited to policy missteps. He boldly declared that the government's failure to confront the true implications of the deal had rendered them complicit in a political farce that jeopardized the nation's security, economic stability, and international standing. He cited emerging global power plays, pointing to China's expanding influence and how even the slightest miscalculation could tip the scales in favor of adversarial forces, thus transforming the debate into a broader discussion about national sovereignty and global accountability. With every sentence, Farage stripped away the veneer of diplomacy, exposing what he considered a raw and unvarnished truth, that the British people were being shortchanged on both their heritage and their future. His voice did not waver even as he directly challenged his political opponents, daring them to stand up and explain how a deal that cost billions while relinquishing control could possibly be in the best interest of the country. The intensity of his discourse was such that even the most stoic MPs could not help but lean forward, caught between shock and reluctant agreement, as he wove a narrative of betrayal and impending crisis that seemed to leave no room for complacency. As the echoes of his words reverberated around the chamber, Farage's passionate diatribe was punctuated by moments of bitter irony, a subtle yet powerful reminder that the very institutions tasked with safeguarding British interests might be the ones orchestrating their undoing. In one sweeping salvo, he challenged the prevailing narrative that legal niceties justified the relinquishment of national assets, arguing instead that true leadership demanded transparency, accountability, and an unyielding commitment to the nation's future. His rhetoric, at once simple and piercing, cut through the bureaucratic jargon and appealed directly to the shared pride of every Briton, setting the stage for a confrontation that would force even the quietest dissenters to reckon with an uncomfortable truth. The price of political convenience might be the loss of a nation's soul. As Nigel Farage moved into the heart of his speech, the chamber felt like it was holding its breath. With no script, no filter, and clearly no fear of political backlash, he turned his focus to the deeper implications of the deal, not just on sovereignty or money, but on something far more volatile: the rising perception that Britain was no longer governed by principles, but by selective justice and ideological bias. His voice now low and deliberate, Farage accused the political class of building what he called a two-tier Britain, where accountability depended not on law, but on who you were and what views you held. He cited recent events cases that had divided the public, enraged online forums, and sparked outrage across the country, arguing that they were not isolated incidents, but symptoms of a broken system. One law for them, he said, and another for the rest of us. He wasn't just talking about the government anymore, he was talking about the entire establishment. He referenced the public outrage following recent prosecutions of ordinary citizens for comments deemed inappropriate online, while individuals with far larger platforms, who had used language many saw as threatening or inciting violence, seemed to face no consequences. Without naming names, he alluded to major controversies that had rocked public trust in the justice system. When hate speech comes from the mouths of those in the elite's favour, he declared, we call it activism. But when it comes from someone outside the political class, we call it criminal. The silence that followed was telling. MPs who had been shaking their heads earlier were now uncomfortably still. The shift from diplomatic policy to domestic outrage was not just calculated, it was incendiary. Farage had successfully connected the international with the personal, showing the public that these weren't distant matters. They were connected to the daily erosion of fairness in the country they lived in. His next move was more daring still. He challenged the media directly, most notably, the BBC, for what he called complicity through cowardice. He condemned the public broadcaster for airing events and performances laced with inflammatory rhetoric. while simultaneously filtering or censoring opposing voices. He accused editorial teams of engaging in cultural gatekeeping, crafting narratives that favoured one side while silencing the other. They tell us they're objective, he sneered, but what they are is obedient to whatever cause happens to be fashionable that week. The blow landed hard. Several MPs could be seen exchanging sharp looks. Others tried to interrupt him, but Farage powered through. If we are going to criminalise hate, he continued, then let's criminalise all of it or none of it. But don't insult the intelligence of the British people by pretending that only some speech is dangerous, depending on who says it. The longer he spoke, the more his speech began to feel like a rallying cry, not just against the government, but against an entire ecosystem of power, from media to judiciary, from backroom diplomats to frontbench MPs. He questioned how the UK could pride itself on moral authority abroad, when its own citizens no longer felt protected or heard at home. This is no longer about left or right, he said. This is about truth and whether we still have the courage to say it out loud, no matter how uncomfortable it makes the people in this chamber feel. There was a kind of rawness in his delivery stripped of polish, free of the usual political gloss that made the message feel both real and dangerous. It wasn't the kind of speech meant to win applause. It was meant to force a reckoning. Farage then delivered one of the most striking lines of the entire address. We cannot call ourselves a free country if truth becomes a liability, and silence is rewarded more than honesty. The weight of the statement hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't just rhetoric. It was an accusation, a warning, and a challenge, all rolled into one. And just like that, the debate had shifted once again. The issue was no longer just Chagos. It was no longer just about a deal, or even sovereignty. It had become a conversation about what Britain was becoming, and whether anyone had the courage left to stop it. As Nigel Farage wrapped up his searing address, the chamber was left in stunned silence. It wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of disruption. Farage had just ripped through every layer of the political facade, exposing the fault lines between parties, institutions, and public trust. But even as MPs tried to regain their composure, the real storm was only just beginning. Outside Parliament, Farage's speech was already making waves. Clips were circulating online at lightning speed. Social media exploded with hashtags, headlines, and heated arguments. Supporters hailed him as the only politician speaking the raw, uncomfortable truth, while critics called him dangerous, provocative, and divisive. But no matter which side you stood on, one thing was undeniable. Parliament had just been shaken, not by a vote, not by a policy shift, but by a single man refusing to be silenced. News outlets scrambled to respond. Some praised the speech as a pivotal moment in British politics, the kind that cuts through the noise and resets the national conversation. Others condemned it as reckless populism, arguing that Farage had stoked division and fanned flames that would be difficult to control. But Farage didn't flinch. In follow-up interviews, he doubled down, repeating his claim that the Chagos Islands deal was not only financially irresponsible, but morally corrupt. He accused both major parties of selling out British interests to maintain international approval and preserve their own fragile reputations. We are being ruled by people who no longer believe in this country, he said, in one fiery appearance. And if I'm the only one willing to say that in public, then so be it. Back inside Westminster, the shockwaves spread further. Ministers were forced to clarify their positions, with some trying to distance themselves from the deal entirely. Government spokespeople began scrambling for language that could contain the backlash without admitting fault. Even the Prime Minister, who had not yet returned from his overseas trip, was drawn into the narrative. Questions began swirling about whether the deal with Mauritius had been rushed, whether it had been properly debated, and whether the financial figures Farage cited were more accurate than previously acknowledged. What had once seemed like a routine diplomatic agreement was now a source of national controversy, and Farage had ensured that no one could pretend otherwise. Perhaps the most striking part of the aftermath was how quickly public sentiment began to shift. Polls taken within 48 hours of the speech showed a surge in support for reviewing the Chagos Islands deal. More notably, a growing percentage of voters said they felt the UK government no longer operated with transparency or in the public interest. Even among traditional Labour and Conservative voters, frustration was brewing. It wasn't just about the islands anymore. It was about trust. Trust in Parliament, trust in the legal system, trust in the media. And it had all been set off by one speech that dared to voice what many were already whispering at home. Opposition parties tried to seize the moment, attempting to reframe the debate in their favour. But they were late to the game. The momentum had already shifted. Farage had tapped into something raw, a sense of national exhaustion with politics as usual. His words resonated not because they were polite or polished, but because they weren't. They were messy, emotional, and full of conviction. And for a public tired of filtered messaging and pre-approved narratives, that kind of clarity hit like a hammer. The establishment could mock him, fact-check him, or dismiss him, but they couldn't ignore him. Not anymore. In the days that followed, petitions began to circulate demanding a formal review of the Chagos deal. Calls grew louder for Parliament to hold an emergency debate on national sovereignty. Reform UK, bolstered by a sudden swell of public attention, announced a new campaign centred around Farage's speech, calling it a turning point in the fight for real political accountability. Meanwhile, Farage himself remained defiant. "This wasn't just a speech," he said in a closing statement. "It was a warning, and if the people in this building don't listen, then the people out there will make sure they're replaced. The dust has not yet settled. And whether or not Farage's words will reshape policy, they have already reshaped perception." For millions, that moment in Parliament wasn't just politics. It was a reckoning, a reminder that sometimes it takes just one voice to jolt a nation awake. In the weeks following Nigel Farage's explosive statement, it became clear that this was not going to be a story that simply faded from the headlines. What he unleashed in that chamber wasn't just outrage, it was momentum. The political class tried to downplay it, the media attempted to spin it, and his critics hoped it would be forgotten. But none of that worked. Because what Farage had said didn't just resonate in Westminster or on talk shows. It landed in living rooms, pubs, workplaces, and on every street corner where people were already fed up. He had given language to what many had been thinking but were too afraid, too uncertain, or too exhausted to voice themselves. And now the question wasn't whether Parliament had been shocked. The question was whether it would ever recover from the hit. The real impact of Farage's words began to surface in subtle but undeniable ways. Civil service insiders reported a surge in interdepartmental disputes over how the Chagos deal had been handled. Leaked memos revealed internal disagreements within Starmer's government about how to contain the political damage. MPs, who had previously been silent, started asking uncomfortable questions in committee meetings. And perhaps most telling of all whispers of leadership dissatisfaction began to circulate behind closed doors. A few brave voices within Labour even admitted, off the record, that the party had completely underestimated the public's emotional connection to issues of sovereignty, national interest, and fairness. "We thought it was a footnote," one source confessed. "Now it feels like the front page." Farage, ever the political disruptor, continued to push the message, not just in speeches, but in interviews, online broadcasts, and town halls packed with voters who felt like they were finally being seen. He reminded them again and again. The billions Britain was prepared to give away, the resources buried in the Chagos archipelago, the growing influence of foreign powers like China in the region, all of it was being brushed aside in favour of appeasement and international approval. And more dangerously, he argued, it was being done without the consent or understanding of the British public. "They don't want your opinion," he said at one rally. "They want your silence." Well, I'm not playing that game anymore, and neither should you. Mainstream media outlets found themselves in a bind. Covering Farage risked amplifying his message. Ignoring him looked like a deliberate blackout, so they tried to thread the needle, acknowledging his impact while casting doubt on his intentions. But every time they questioned his motives, Farage turned the spotlight back on them, accusing journalists of defending the establishment instead of holding it accountable. He called out what he described as the curated outrage economy, where some voices were platformed while others were punished. The irony, he pointed out, was that in trying to contain him, they had only given him more ammunition. Meanwhile, public protests and petitions grew. Outside Parliament, demonstrators gathered with signs that read, "Sovereignty is not for sale, and one law for all." It was no longer just Reform UK supporters showing up, these were average citizens from across the spectrum. People who didn't necessarily align with Farage on every issue, but who now saw him as the only one calling out what they felt was a deeper sickness in the democratic system. Even some political commentators admitted, reluctantly, that Farage had tapped into something real, something potent, something that was shifting the political ground beneath their feet. And as the next round of elections loomed on the horizon, party strategists were rattled. Reform UK saw a sudden rise in polling numbers. Candidates across the country reported a surge in constituents bringing up the Chagos speech during campaign stops. And for Labour and the Conservatives, the fear wasn't just about votes, it was about losing control of the narrative. Because in the post-Farage era, people were no longer swallowing carefully prepared talking points. They were demanding answers, real ones. And if the traditional parties couldn't provide them, Voters were more than ready to find someone who would. What Farage did that day wasn't just shock Parliament. He broke something open, something raw and unresolved in the national conscience. And whether you agreed with him or not, whether you liked him or loathed him, one thing was now certain. The political landscape had changed. His statement had forced a national reckoning, not just over a deal, not just over a policy, but over who gets to speak, who gets to be heard, and who really holds the power in modern Britain.